Imagine being 18 years old and suddenly finding out that the rest of your life might be spent behind bars for a murder you did not commit. Now imagine something even harder to understand. Imagine spending nearly 4 decades trying to prove that you were innocent. 39 years. 39 years is longer than many people spend in their entire adult lives. And for Ricky Jackson, those years were taken from him because of a murder conviction that would eventually collapse when the case's key witness admitted that he had never actually seen the crime. The witness was only 12 years old when everything began. His name was Eddie Vernon, and his testimony would help send 3 young men to death row. There was no DNA evidence linking Ricky Jackson to the murder. There was no physical evidence connecting him to the crime. The case against him rested primarily on the word of a child who later admitted that he had lied about witnessing the murder. And nearly 40 years later, that same witness would help bring the truth to light. This is the story of Ricky Jackson. In 1975, Ricky Jackson was 18 years old and living in Cleveland, Ohio. He was young. He had friends. He had a life that was supposed to continue normally. 2 brothers who were friends with him, Wiley and Ronnie Bridgman, would soon become caught up in the same nightmare. Wiley was 20. Ronnie was 17. They were young men at the beginning of their lives. But on May 19th, 1975, everything changed. A Cleveland businessman named Harold Franks was murdered outside a neighborhood grocery store. Franks was a money order collector, and he was carrying money orders when he was attacked. The crime shocked the neighborhood. Police began investigating, looking for whoever had committed the murder. And then they found a witness. His name was Eddie Vernon. He was 12 years old. Vernon told police that he had seen the crime, and he identified Ricky Jackson and the Bridgman brothers as the people responsible. That statement would become the foundation of the case. But years later, Vernon would tell a very different story. According to his later testimony, he had actually been on a school bus near the area when he heard gunshots. He said he could not actually see what was happening at the crime scene. He had heard a rumor and went to the police with the names of Jackson and the Bridgman brothers. But when he later tried to back away from the story, Vernon said detectives pressured and intimidated him into continuing with it. The National Registry of Exonerations records that Vernon testified he had tried to recant, but detectives threatened that his parents could be arrested for perjury if he backed out. And that is where this story becomes difficult to comprehend, because Ricky Jackson was 18 years old. He was not an experienced criminal. He was a teenager. Yet the accusation against him was treated as enough to move the case forward. Jackson and the 2 Bridgman brothers were arrested. They were eventually convicted of the murder, and all 3 were sentenced to death. Think about that for a moment. 3 young men, 3 lives, and a death sentence. But there was something missing. The physical evidence that should have connected them to the murder was not there. The Innocence Project has described the case as being based primarily on the testimony of 12-year-old Eddie Vernon, with no other evidence linking Jackson and the other defendants to the crime. Yet the convictions stood. Ricky Jackson was sent to death row. At 18 years old, he suddenly had to live with the knowledge that the state intended to execute him. He maintained that he was innocent. But innocence by itself does not automatically open a prison door. Then, in the late 1970s, Ohio's death penalty situation changed. Jackson's death sentence was eventually commuted to life imprisonment. He would not be executed, but he was still imprisoned. And for Ricky Jackson, that meant something almost as devastating. His entire youth would disappear behind prison walls. The years began to pass. 1 year became 5. 5 became 10. 10 became 20. The world outside kept moving. The 1970s became the 1980s. The 1980s became the 1990s. Then came the 2000s. People who had been children when Ricky entered prison became adults. Some became parents. Some became grandparents. Technology transformed the world. Cities changed. Music changed. The way people communicated changed. But Ricky Jackson remained in prison. He continued to insist that he had not committed the murder. And eventually, after decades had passed, something began to change. the case was being looked at again. A 2011 investigation brought renewed attention to the old conviction and to the problems surrounding the original eyewitness testimony. And that investigation eventually reached Eddie Vernon. By then, Vernon was no longer the frightened 12-year-old boy who had first spoken to police. He was an adult, and he had spent decades carrying the memory of what had happened. Then he decided to tell the truth. In court, Vernon recanted his testimony. He admitted that he had not actually witnessed the murder. He said that information had been fed to him and that his original story was false. The Innocence Project reported that Vernon told the court he had lied to police, prosecutors, and juries, and that he had no actual knowledge of what happened at the crime scene. Suddenly, the case that had seemed so certain decades earlier began to fall apart. Because if the central eyewitness was now saying that he had never seen the murder, what was left? That question changed everything. In November 2014, Ricky Jackson's case returned to court. The hearing lasted 2 days. And on November 18th, Cuyahoga County Prosecutor Timothy McGinty announced that the state would no longer oppose Jackson's request for a new trial. The National Registry records the prosecutor's words as a concession that the evidence had effectively collapsed. 3 days later, on November 21st, 2014, Judge Richard McMonigle granted the motions for a new trial filed by Jackson and Wiley Bridgman and vacated their convictions. The prosecution then dismissed the charges. Ricky Jackson was finally free. He had spent 39 years, 3 months, and 9 days in prison. At the time, the National Registry of Exonerations recorded it as the longest period of imprisonment for any defendant exonerated in United States history. Think about the difference between 18 and 57. When Ricky Jackson entered prison, he was 18 years old. When he walked out, he was 57. He had entered prison as a young man. He came out having spent nearly 4 decades inside. The world he returned to was not the world he remembered. And that is one of the hardest things about wrongful imprisonment to understand. Freedom does not give someone back the years that were taken. It does not give back family moments. It does not give back family moments. It does not give back the ordinary mornings that should have been part of a person's life. It simply gives them the opportunity to live whatever time remains. Jackson later described the experience in a way that captures the enormous passage of time. He said he felt as if he had gone to sleep at 18 and awakened decades later. But perhaps the most extraordinary part of Ricky Jackson's story came after he was finally released. Because there was one person who could have been the easiest person in the world to hate: Eddie Vernon. The child whose testimony had helped put him behind bars. The man who, decades later, admitted that he had lied about witnessing the murder. Jackson could have chosen anger. He could have spent the rest of his life demanding revenge. Instead, he chose forgiveness. That does not mean what happened to him was acceptable. It does not erase 39 years. It does not erase the suffering of 3 young men who were convicted and imprisoned. And it certainly does not make the original injustice disappear. But Jackson understood something very difficult. He had already lost almost 4 decades. He did not want to lose whatever time he had left to hatred. That is what makes this story bigger than a wrongful conviction case. It becomes a story about human beings, about fear, about authority, about mistakes, about how one person's assumption can influence another person's decision, until eventually an entire system begins acting as though a theory is a fact. And perhaps the most important lesson is this: a witness can be wrong. A child can be manipulated. An investigator can become convinced that they have found the right answer. And once that happens, every new piece of information can begin to look like confirmation. That is why evidence matters. That is why investigations have to remain open to the possibility that the first answer may be wrong. And that is why cases like Ricky Jackson's continue to matter. Because the justice system is not operated by machines. It is operated by people. And people can make mistakes. Sometimes those mistakes are small. Sometimes they can cost someone a few years. And sometimes, as in Ricky Jackson's case, they can cost someone almost an entire lifetime. The story also leaves us with another uncomfortable question. What happened to Harold Franks? He was murdered in 1975. His family lost someone they loved. And justice for the victim matters just as much as justice for the accused. A wrongful conviction does not solve a murder. It only creates another tragedy. One person is gone. Another person's life is destroyed. And the real question of who committed the crime can remain unanswered. That is why getting the right answer matters so much. Not simply because an innocent person deserves freedom, but because the truth matters for everyone. For the victim, for the victim's family, for the accused, for the witness, and for the society that depends on the justice system to tell the difference between suspicion and proof. Ricky Jackson eventually walked free. He received compensation for the years he lost, but no amount of money could return him to 18 years old. No court could give him back the decades he missed. No settlement could recreate the life he should have lived. The only thing he could control was what he did with the time that remained. And he chose to live. He chose to move forward. And he chose to forgive. 39 years earlier, an 18-year-old entered prison. 39 years later, a 57-year-old man walked out. Between those two moments was an entire lifetime. A lifetime that could never be recovered. And perhaps that is why Ricky Jackson's story still matters. Because the most dangerous words in a criminal investigation may not be, "We don't know." They may be, "We know." Because the moment people stop asking questions, the possibility of a mistake becomes much harder to see. Ricky Jackson spent 39 years behind bars because the system believed it had the answer. In the end, the answer was wrong. And the truth came from the very witness whose childhood testimony had helped create the conviction. So when we look back at this case, perhaps the question is not simply, how could a 12-year-old lie? The deeper question is, how could a 12-year-old's words become powerful enough to take 39 years of another person's life? And maybe the final lesson is even simpler. Justice is not just about finding someone to blame. Justice is about finding the truth. And sometimes, finding the truth means having the courage to admit that the answer we believed for decades was never the truth at all. This was the story of Ricky Jackson, a teenager who went into prison at 18, a man who came out nearly 40 years later, and a life that reminds us that when someone's freedom is at stake, we should never stop asking one question: what if we're wrong?